I feel like you're able to create this like global
喂
perspective
喂
on
你
how
好
the issues you're talking about and trying to solve can have implications everywhere.
So what I wanted to do with this video was to think a little bit more creatively, and this is what led to my decision to use a video game. I wanted the video to serve as kind of a reminder to the viewers to start taking small initiatives in their lives, like using a reusable cup instead of a paper one, or bringing their home lunch instead of opting to buy the school lunch, which may have single-use products in it. This video was kind of the last piece of the puzzle that kind of represented what we learned throughout the year about the problem and what we could do to solve the issues.
Most of my time is spent with post-secondary students, so people who are doing their tertiary degrees. These are students who are interested in teaching and learning. When I think about the schools that they're going into or the learning opportunities they're
Thank you so much.
usually. Oh, okay. Okay. So slide control. I don't know that.
Wait, test.
Oh, okay. So do we do anything?
Eye infection. Like I do a podcast, a YouTube podcast with sunglasses, and a whole innovation tutorial with sunglasses. All no piece without lights. But tutorial um, can you do it? Can you reduce the time? Yeah. Test. don't even need to hold the microphone up, right?
Yeah, I think
Fix
so.
it up like that. Yeah, but I can put it here.
Oh, you don't want to.
Yeah, but I don't think I need to put it to my mouth.
Hello. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for coming today to this public lecture with Professor Martin Epler. I understand that we have also an audience online on Bilibili, so welcome everybody, whether offline or online. It's wonderful to see old and new faces, colleagues, friends, students, welcome again. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Alice Comi. I'm an associate professor in the College of Design and Innovation at Tongji University. And I'm also serving as the associate editor for our journal, Shiji, the Journal of Design, Economics, and Innovation. It is a real pleasure and a privilege for me today to host this public lecture with Professor Martin Epler. Thank you very much, Martin, for coming to Shanghai today. I have been knowing Martin for quite a long time now. Martin was my supervisor in Switzerland more than 10 years ago. And he's been an excellent mentor and advisor. So I'm very grateful for his collaboration and commitment. And we are still working together these days. We are collaborating on a book project on visualization and literature reviews. Martin has an impressive track record of publications and books, but apart from this, I think, at least in my opinion, the most important part of his work is his long-standing commitment to improve communication clarity. And Martin does that through the power of visualization. And today in this lecture, I don't want to spoiler it, but we will see how this applies not just to interpersonal communication, but also to our work as scholars and practitioners, especially as we become interested in reviewing the literature and getting stock of knowledge to generate novel insights and push the boundaries of our field. So I will not say more than this. I'm very happy to welcome Martin to the stage. Thank you, Martin, for coming to Shanghai.
谢谢. Thank you very much, Alice, and thank you for coming. Welcome to this short talk on what is perhaps the most central and informative research product that scholars produce, the literature review. But literature reviews, whether you write them as part of your bachelor or master thesis or PhD thesis or as an article in its own right, they're also tedious to do. Many students I've talked to and Alice has talked to, they complain how labor-intensive, how tedious it is. And then on the other side, many readers complain that literature reviews don't really give them orientation and an overview. And they complain that the literature reviews are not usable enough. So today I want to show you simple ways in which you can make the design of literature reviews easier, both from a process perspective and from an outcome result perspective. How you can use the power of pictures to really illuminate literature reviews. And you see that here on my title slide. There's a little asterisk when it comes to scientific discourse, because of course there are so many different kinds of literature reviews, from the quantitative meta-analysis to the very critical or narrative literature reviews. And of course there are also many disciplines that you can do a literature review about, from the natural sciences to medicine to design to my own turf, the business and management realm. What we want to do in this project that Alice and I are doing and the book we're writing is also learn from different disciplines, like from medicine or even biology, or we even learn from agricultural research, how they review literature, and apply this to design studies, to management studies, to produce better literature reviews. As Alice said, our aim is to produce or enable literature reviews that are also more useful for practitioners who can work with the insights that academics have come up with. If you're interested in this topic, we have a website called visualliteracy.org where you can find a lot more. But this is very much work in progress. So what we're showing you is directly from the lab. I want to share 5 things with you. Why visualization is direly needed for literature reviews, what the benefits of images, of visualization for synthesizing academic research. So the why of visualizing literature reviews, I'll start with that. And basically you'll see it really boosts rigor and relevance for literature reviews. Then what we're actually visualizing when we use visualization, and then how, this is where I will focus mostly on, our pattern approach to doing literature reviews. Because we've seen that a lot of guidelines and guides to literature review, they're not very user-friendly. And we have come up with an approach that's much more modular and user-friendly called the pattern approach. And you will see some of these patterns and examples in the third part. But then we should also talk about the risks and limitations of this approach. I will share some caveats with you when you're visualizing literature, because that doesn't mean that you don't have to read anymore. It doesn't mean that text is no longer important. I'll also talk a little bit how this pattern approach can enable your use of artificial intelligence when you conduct literature reviews. What you will see is these review patterns are excellent AI prompts that make your life easier when you're trying to do a literature review. And I'll also provide a brief outlook in the end into that future of AI-assisted literature reviews, a topic, of course, that in 2025 we have to address. And I think that with the advent of AI, these patterns become even more powerful. So let's dive right in with the first part, the benefits. And I just want to share our key idea with you from the start. There are a few patterns already out there. There are a few visuals that you see popping up in many literature reviews. One of them is the Prisma chart that has become almost a standard in showing how you have proceeded to screen the relevant literature. This is a must-use tool. You can download the template at prismastatement.org in many variations. And you will see many variations that are often based on this Prisma template. Some of them may include practitioner literature as well as scientific one. Some may include other sources, but it's a 3-step process, from screening and choosing the literature that is made transparent and replicable through this. And as we have this Prisma chart, we don't need to come up with alternative forms of visualization. I've also come up with alternatives, but it's much more efficient if we all use the same visual. Imagine if the traffic signs would be different in every city. That would be really confusing, right? If in one city the stop sign is blue, and in the next one, it's maybe yellow and it's a circle and the other is a square. It makes sense to have a standardized language that is visual. And we are slowly getting there also with literature reviews. The Prisma chart is one example. It solves the problem, how do I show my reader what I have reviewed, how I have proceeded, right? Now, this is just for one review problem. We have compiled more than 25 such patterns. There is another one that is frequently used, named after its inventor, the Joya chart, where basically in 3 steps you condense, for example, definitions that you have found in a literature review to certain themes, and then aggregated dimensions in a visual way that's quite easy to understand, quite intuitive. That's another example of how you can make your literature reviews more visual. You condense dimensions discussed in the literature to themes, and then these themes to dimensions in order to show the varieties of facets studied in the literature regarding your phenomenon or concept, whatever it is that you're reviewing. Joya chart and Prisma chart are two already existing patterns. What we have done, we have developed additional ones based on the idea of a standardized visual language for literature reviews. And I just want to show you this analysis that shows actually the power of visualization is not yet used in literature reviews. Mostly it's graphs. But look at this. There's only one Venn diagram that's been used, one alluvial or Sankey diagram, or two tree diagrams, 3 timelines. In this analysis of the use of visualization in systematic literature reviews, we see, don't look too far, just go to the bar chart. Most of them use only the bar chart. But I tell you, the visual realm is much richer than just bar charts. We can visualize literature in much better ways than simply using bar charts to show the most cited articles, or that there are more articles now than in the past about a particular topic. That's not very clever visualization when it comes to literature reviews. So, when you use good visualization, diagrams, timelines, Sankey diagrams, Venn diagrams, you can make your literature review much more relevant to your readers by increasing its usefulness and also its ergonomics, its usability. It can be more browsable. People find what they are interested in more easily. It helps the reader have orientation in a large corpus of literature. Right? It's also more fun, by the way, to read a literature review that's not just text and has some graphics. And what's very important, it helps to also share your findings more easily, not just on, in the academic community, but also on social media. Images, as you know, on social media are more shared than just text, right? And also it helps you because research is collaborative, have better discussions. You can modify the diagram together, you can tweak it. But mostly I would endorse it because it really makes trends, contrasts, differences, commonalities, correlations, effects much more tangible and visible at one glance. So it really is a way to have more user-friendly literature reviews. But it also helps to increase the quality of literature reviews methodologically. It improves transparency and replicability. For example, with the very Prisma chart that I just shown you, where you can really see what steps has this researcher undertaken to screen the relevant literature. So you can show the review process, and you can show, I will also demonstrate that in a minute, the criteria you have applied, the selection criteria for your literature, and you can show in a heat map the evidence that you have aggregated, and this makes it, and also make argumentations visible that you can find in the literature. So we believe that visualization is really a great conduit to more rigor and more relevance in literature reviews, making it more replicable, transparent, but also usable through the visuals that you integrate into a literature review. And again, whether you are publishing a literature review article or whether you are conducting a literature review as part of your master thesis or a PhD thesis or even bachelor thesis. And the beauty of that is, by using these visuals, you're automatically guided to a better literature review. It's not just that you're a better communicator of your literature review. By using the templates, the visuals, you can ensure that your review is more rigorous. So I've given you a few reasons why to use visualization. It helps you conduct the literature review. It's fun. It's a better communication output at the end. It increases rigor and relevance. Let's actually look at what is visualized, what questions are answered, and how you go about doing this. It's not just always boxes and arrows like in the case of the Joya chart or the Prisma chart. So here's what problems visualization solves in the literature review context. Just a few examples. How did the authors get to the review corpus? How did they select the literature? That's a very important question. And guess what? The Prisma chart answers that. What is the scope of the review? What was included and excluded? You will see there's a criteria chart that visualizes exactly the answer to that question. Something that's often a problem with literature reviews, you don't know for whom is it? For whom is this literature review relevant? For that, we've also developed a visualization that I will share with you in a minute. How did the topic evolve over the last decade, for example? What was the progress made in this research area? For that, we can use the visualization format of a timeline. How's it been conceived, framed? We can use a Joya chart or a Sankey. What are the subfields? You will see that in literature review visualization, there are two types: qualitative, like the Joya chart or the Prisma chart I just shown you, and quantitative, like citation networks, co-citation networks, co-occurrence networks. And citation networks, they are a great way to understand the domain and its subfields. But also, it's important to show visually where are research gaps. You can also do that graphically. Where are research questions that have not been answered? What are avenues for the future? There are many questions that, with the right visual, you can answer it in a compelling way. And what we have found is we need 5 types of visuals for literature reviews. We need first procedural ones that show how the literature review was conducted. We need conceptual visualizations that integrate all concepts and variables and show, for example, a framework. We need what we call territorial or domain visualizations that show the field and its subfields, and also who's active in it, the researchers. We need visuals that show the evidence, the data that has been compiled by different studies that you review. And last but not least, we need methodological visuals that show which methods have been used in this field of literature, and maybe what's missing and what's dominating. So these are the 5 types of visuals that are useful in conducting literature reviews and communicating them in a more usable manner. And I will give you at least 1 or 2 examples for each one of them. But I think this is important. We don't do visuals just for nice pictures. We do them to answer important questions that any literature review should address. So you might ask yourself, well, how does it look? And is there anything new? Are there any innovations, right? Because I'm here at the College of Design and Innovation, so we better also propose some new stuff. And the Prisma chart and the Joya chart have been around. What is new is our approach based on an architectural method called the pattern approach by Alexander and others, has also been applied in software patterns, in design patterns. We're applying that to literature review. We call them ref patterns, review patterns, and they are widely usable, generic, informative, visual literature summary templates for a given corpus of research that solve typical literature review challenges or answer the questions that I just have shown you. So it's systematic, it's visual, and it addresses key challenges. And as I have just shown you, there are 5 such pattern groups. The procedural ones about the literature review itself, conceptual, about the key concepts and variables, territorial, that's really about the domain and the researcher active in it, the evidence or data, and the methodological ones. And each pattern, that's a characteristic of this approach, has a name, has a problem that it solves, has an approach to address that problem, has a visual or sometimes different visuals that help implement this approach, and has certain anti-patterns or risks or caveats, what you have to really pay attention when you use the pattern. So it's not just an image, it's an image that comes with sort of like medicine, with a little description of how to use it, right? With the side effects and maybe risks and what you have to be careful when you use that pattern. And we believe that any PhD student or master student should know about 20 of these, to give you a rough figure. The essentials are maybe 20 that are widely usable. And they rely, these visual formats, are quite diverse. It can be network charts, it can be heat maps, it can be box and arrow diagrams, it can be timelines, but it can also be, and we found quite a lot of that, alluvial or Sankey diagrams, it can be radar plots, and it can also be what Alice calls multimodal tables and what I call rich tables, tables that are enhanced with spark lines, with icons, with visual elements. You will see examples of this right now. I just want to give you a very simple map of these 20 patterns before I show them to you. And this is something that is very useful when you think about literature reviews. A great approach is to think in directions. You can review back and look at the last 10 years of a field. But you can also review up and synthesize all the evidence or concepts. You can review below by scrutinizing the assumptions or biases or blind spots in a field, or you can review across and connect different disciplines. For example, when you compare different approaches to planning in design, in management, and in engineering. And you can, of course, review ahead where you're using your literature review to develop an agenda for the future of a field. So reviewing up means synthesizing evidence, arguments, methods through charts. Reviewing back means visualizing a timeline, how this research domain has evolved over typically the last 10 years. Most literature reviews in most disciplines have a time scope of 10 years, 5 to 20, and I would say the most frequent time span is 10 years. Maybe that will become shorter as more research is produced. And then, of course, reviewing ahead is outlining different possible avenues or trajectories, how a field may evolve. And reviewing below is when you uncover assumptions, preferences, biases, or blind spots, or underlying on epistemological stances. And then for interdisciplinary literature reviews, which we find very important but not often undertaken, it's really about comparing literatures and approaches and integrating different perspectives. That's, I think, especially for design students and management students, a very important type of literature review. That should be done more. Interdisciplinary literature reviews, where you review across disciplines, studies about a certain topic. And now we can position our patterns, whether they are more forward-looking or backward-looking, whether they're more about aggregating evidence or going into maybe the methodologies or the concepts and the paradigms of an area. So that's a sort of a map of the visualizations that we have developed and that are out there. Some help you synthesize evidence, some help you scrutinize the methods, some help you really analyze the past to prepare the future. Okay, now I've given a lot of intro and you might say, well, show us these patterns. So here's a new one, and you're the first ones to see it. This is a sort of a grand opening. We call this one the audience map, and it comes out of the problem that often it is unclear who is the target group for a literature review, right? You have to read the whole article to find out, oh, this wasn't really for me. So wouldn't it be great if there is a visual at the beginning that shows you, am I the target group of this literature review? And by the way, that also helps you as a student or as a scholar or a researcher be more purpose-oriented in your literature review, always having the target group in mind. The approach to solve this problem is you segment the target group into core and peripheral, and you distinguish the core research community, practitioners that might find your literature review pertinent, society and regulators, if you have something that might be of interest to them. And here's something really important. Literature reviews are a key ingredient of large language models. They're a really important feed of AI. And so whenever you as a scholar today write a literature review, you have to keep in mind that you're also writing it for AI and for future AI users. And we know that AI has certain bias. Keep in mind that you're also writing it for AI and for future AI users. And we know that AI has certain biases, overgeneralizing, for example, right? So you need to also think about how can you avoid that AI overgeneralizes your results by being very explicit about the boundary conditions, limitations, and incorrect summarization of your findings. This is something that we will always have to consider in the future as a stakeholder of a literature review. How will AI use my literature review? How will future users come across my literature review through the chatbot prompting? And we have to anticipate errors there. And the map that we're using is a sectorial map. And of course, you need to tailor your literature review to your core group. You can't serve everyone. And here's how it looks. So the inner circle is your core research community. For many of you, it's probably design science, design studies, right? Or for me, it would be people active in knowledge management or in strategy. But when you do a literature review, for example, here maybe on the concept of trust, it may also be interesting for people beyond your core community. Scholars, for example, here, computer scientists that can really learn from this literature review. And you can also add what it is in the literature review that these other target groups might find most interesting. And some, hopefully if you're in applied social sciences, insights from a literature review are also helpful for practitioners, for managers, or for designers. Yet other results are interesting for the greater public or for regulators. And as I mentioned, you should always consider future AI users and how they will have access to your findings through the interface of a chatbot. Right? So this should make clear at one glance for whom is this literature review, primarily and secondarily. And you know, depending on your literature review, the boundary may be narrower or wider. You may be very specific in your literature review or a bit wider in the case of interdisciplinary literature reviews. So that's an example of a review pattern that is procedural because it's about the literature review itself and not what you have found. There's another procedural review pattern that we call the criteria chart. It solves the problem that there's an unclear scope of a literature review because there's no clearly discernible inclusion and exclusion criteria and where they have been relaxed. So our approach is to provide a weighted, segmented chart that shows which criteria were the most important ones and have there been exceptions to them. And for that we use a burst chart. I'll show that to you in a minute. And of course, when you establish such selection criteria for the literature that you're going to discuss, you shouldn't violate it too much. And here's how it looks. So it's a chart about the inclusion criteria. For example, we're only going to look at articles from the last 10 years. We're only going to look at English articles that have been published in peer-reviewed journals, and only those where the keyword that we're choosing, the keywords that we're choosing for our literature review have appeared in the title or the abstract. But then, as you can see, there are exceptions. Maybe you have found it's called the snowball method in the references additional articles that are pertinent. Maybe there were some books or conference proceedings that were really important. So you went beyond that criterion in that case. Or I'm Swiss, so my native language is German, and maybe I have some seminal articles that I found for the literature review in German that are also included in the literature review. That's the blue zone right there, right? And the size of the pie, the size of this donut is how many articles were generated or included based on that criterion. It can also have other meanings, but that seems to be quite a useful one. So here you can see at one glance what are the inclusion criteria and in which cases have there been exemptions to those criteria. At the moment, this is mostly done in table form, which is not always very informative. Now, the most widely used pattern in literature reviews today is not the Prisma chart. It's not the Joya chart. It's the integrative framework. It solves the problem to have a non-simplistic synthesis of the cumulative research progress in the field in an accessible, informative way. And there are different ways in which you can generate such a graphic framework. You do one that's completely new based on what you have found in the literature, and I'll show you examples of that we've come up with. Or you modify an existing one so that it can really summarize all of the different articles that you found. That will be a more deductive use. Or, this is also interesting for literature reviews, you take a framework that's from another domain and apply it to your domain to summarize articles. And the visuals are usually boxes and arrows, cycles, layers. And of course, you want a framework that has strong explanatory power. You want to also highlight non-trivial findings, and there are other caveats. So these frameworks you find a lot in many literature reviews. Here's one from an article that you might find interesting. It looks at design and entrepreneurship. It looks at design as an epistemology of entrepreneurship, as a logic of entrepreneurship, as a methodology or an ontology of entrepreneurship, or as a phenomenology. And it visualizes that by putting the entrepreneur in the middle. The logic is his sort of mindset. The epistemology is sort of the lens that connects the micro, meso, and macro level. And then there's an entrepreneurship process that sort of is guided by this design methodology. That's a typical integrative framework right there. I can show you a few. Sorry about this. I can show you a few other such integrative frameworks. They are typically based on existing models. Here's one that's quite famous on organizational cognition. So it takes a typical model of organizational cognition, that we have an environment that we represent, we have a knowledge structure that we develop and use, and Walsh just converts this framework into a table where he reviews all the literature and structures it based on the level of analysis. And that's something that you also find often in integrative frameworks, that you distinguish individual, group, organizational levels of analysis, and that you also distinguish between empirical and non-empirical work. And then you can map all the articles. So that will be another example of an integrative framework based on an established model. Right. Or here's one that we developed to study the phenomenon of information overload, its causes, its contexts, its countermeasures, what you can do against it, and its symptoms, how you can recognize it. And we've been able to allocate all the findings on information overload into these different boxes. So this would be a typical circular integrative framework. Or here's a more comprehensive one. This is an integrative framework on, as you can see, meetings and their role for the strategy process, where they have integrated all the research into just 3 areas: contingency factors, meeting functions and practices, sort of the micro level, and then the strategy process, the organizational level, and there they have a process of variation, selection, and retention. Thank you very much for a better microphone. Let's hope this one is better. Or here's one that we have used to summarize. Here is one that we have used to summarize all the issues that affect strategy implementation. So with colleagues, we have made a comprehensive literature review of the factors that influence strategy implementation. And again, you can see that it has levels and steps in a process. And that is very typical of integrative frameworks. The key rule for an integrative framework: does it have components that are mutually exclusive, non-overlapping, and collectively exhaustive? Can you put all articles I go back to this microphone. The key rule for the integrative framework as a literature review pattern is it made up of elements that are non-overlapping, disjunct, mutually exclusive, on the same level of abstraction and granularity, but together really cover the field. That's the art. And in the book that we're producing, we're also giving guidelines on how to use this pattern. And it's one of the most important ones to synthesize literature conceptually. There's a review pattern that I want to share with you that's more about the domain, because many times you struggle to understand a phenomenon from different perspectives. So where has, for example, planning been studied before, or trust, or where has talent been studied? Anything profits when it is visualized in terms of its disciplinary boundaries. And you can do that with a very simple Venn diagram, where you can show where there's lots of interdisciplinary research and where there's little. Let me show you two examples of that. Right? For example, this is a literature review that we did a while back on information overload, and we showed that the majority of studies had a single disciplinary focus, whether it was marketing, computer science, or MIS, accounting, or organization, and that organization studies were the ones that had actually the most interdisciplinary approaches, and we featured those researchers in the intersection to the respective field where they have incorporated findings from marketing, from accounting, or from management information systems, right? And we invite other scholars to do likewise. Or here's a second example of that Venn diagram, a bit more complicated, this one, where you see the intersection of computer science, communication, education, hospitality management, management itself, and psychology. And you see where there's a lot of cross-fertilization, for example, here, you know, in the domains of psychology, communication, and management, and maybe where it's more isolated. And that's useful. The best visuals are those that when you look at them, you have an aha moment. Ideally, literature review visuals tell you something that you didn't know before. That when you look at them, you say, oh, wow, psychology, communication, and management, that seems to be something that has a lot of synergy, right? As does computer science and psychology. But maybe you also see areas where there's less overlap, like why is, in this case, pedagogy, education sciences, not more used? So a good review pattern is one that generates novel insights that you wouldn't have if you just write about the literature analysis. Let's explore that idea with the next one, a timeline. So this is looking back, right? We just looked across, remember, from our directions, and now we're looking back. So how has a field evolved? That's the problem that we're solving with this pattern. And we want to map the seminal contributions and how they build on one another with a very simple timeline that has maybe 2 sections, right? And of course, you want to have good distinctions. For example, a distinction that we found useful is the one between conceptual contributions and empirical contributions. And here you can easily see at one glance how certain seminal articles have built on previous ones, right? Or you can also see how they have then contributed to other studies. And you can also see the interplay between conceptual studies on this topic and empirical studies. And sometimes you can add sort of eras to this chart. So you can say first there was, for example, this is the literature about the tool I'm using right now. This is the research about the negative effects of PowerPoint on communication. And you can see from our analysis that there were 3 eras, 3 phases of research about PowerPoint: the early criticism, then the heated debate, and then the scientific takeoff of research on PowerPoint. And you can use color coding to distinguish different types of articles. You can use bubble size for citations or impact. There are different ways in which you can review the past to prepare the future. And remember, before we had empirical and conceptual. Here it's academic research versus non-academic research, which I think is also an interesting distinction for the design space, right? Where the practitioner view is also very important. That was the timeline pattern. Maybe just a few more. One that's my personal favorite, a Sankey, where you relate methods to topics. You show which methodologies have already been explored and which not. This can look like this, where you can see, in the area of usability studies, a lot of case study work has been done, but the dominating form of evaluation has been experiment, but not classic experiment. They were supplemented through interviews, thinking aloud protocols, and sometimes even questionnaires, right? And some, in this domain, they also use these very novel methods in an experimental context. So you see what has been used a lot, experiments. What hasn't been used a lot, surveys, right? Only 4 articles use that, and case studies. And then also you see which, in this case, data collection methods have been used, right? So you see, for example, wow, a lot of the experiments were actually accompanied by questionnaires, which makes sense. And again, the best visual is one that gives you a so what, that gives you an insight of what should be done differently, of maybe blind spots. So that's another pattern, the method. Thank you. Then just to conclude, there are more qualitative and quantitative patterns. Argument maps are one where you visualize the claims made in a body of literature in an aggregate level through a so-called Toulmin map or through a hierarchic argument map, where you may show the evidence, the claims, a qualifier, how strong the evidence is linked to the claims, and sometimes even counterclaims. You can also add rebuttals and maybe show that there are different sub-communities in a domain and not all of them agree on the construct. And then, of course, in the area of meta-analysis, in quantitative literature reviews, there are quite a few patterns. Co-occurrence networks with the viewer is quite a common one. Here I would criticize that they're not always very informative. You do them because they're easy to do, but they don't always add value. For example, you look at which words in the change management literature are occurring a lot in articles together, like change management and sense making, organizational change, leadership and change is something that you see here in this analysis is often used together. And that allows you maybe to understand the territory better and the key concepts, right? Or here's the same for corporate social responsibility, where you see certain prominent features popping up right away. Or here's an interesting one that shows the quantitative-qualitative divide when you visualize the co-occurrence of keywords, and you see that in maybe qualitative research, it's more about practice, power, the field, identity, notions, and boundaries, and it's about sociology and politics and discourse, whereas in data, it's about measuring, it's about age, it's about categories, it's about variables, right? It's about cohorts, it's about rates, and you understand something about the different domains through these co-occurrence cluster charts. They are used a lot because they're very easy to do. Our main criticism would be they don't always add value. They don't always have an insight that they convey. And then, of course, there's a lot of patterns that are just regarding evidence. You can, here we have a lot to learn from medicine. Medicine has always been evidence-based, and they have a whole repertoire of visual patterns. They're called forest plots, they're called evidence grids, they're called heat maps. And we can really learn from medicine, also for management, for design, on how to aggregate evidence in a more visual way, for example, by showing where there's studies missing, that's the red in this heat map, and where there are already a lot of studies. And in this way, you can through the evidence, visualization prepare the ground for the future of a field and show where there is research needed, where there aren't any studies, and where there are some. This would be an example of a heat map pattern, and we would argue that as design is becoming more evidence-based, as management studies is becoming more evidence-based, we should give these heat maps, evidence grids, much more prominence in our literature reviews, as also more empirical studies are available. But of course, methodologically, this is not always easy because the evidence bases are sometimes quite heterogeneous. Which brings me to the final risks in using such visuals. Just a few caveats. As you can see, I am very enthusiastic about it. I really believe visualization can take literature reviews to the next level. However, we have to be mindful of a few visual risks. Simply visualizing, like we see it in a lot of meta-analysis reviews, is not the answer. You must always do it purpose-driven, right? Have an insight that you convey. Just analyzing and showing that there are more articles in a domain, I think has limited value. Just showing who cites whom and what are the maybe co-authorships. That could be interesting, but what is the value for the future of the field? With visualization, you always have to be mindful of not oversimplifying and abstracting away from the actual articles. But on the other hand, we have screened diagrams that are just totally overloaded and inaccessible because they contain too many details, and that is the other sort of extreme risk that you run. Also, sometimes, for example, when you develop an integrative framework too early, there's a risk that you retrofit all the new articles that you find into your framework because you like it so much. And here it's really important that you remain skeptical towards your own work, that you switch your frameworks and extend them, and don't get boxed in by the visual too soon, that you really leave it revisable for a long time and expose it to other opinion. What we also found when we have looked at existing visuals in literature reviews, sometimes the researchers have done a bad job choosing the right chart for the message that they're trying to convey, right? For example, using bar charts when you should have used trend or line charts to show trends, right? Or using a Sankey diagram when it's not about connection but evolution, and so forth. And with that, let me come to the conclusion. I hope I've been able to show you that when you visualize literature, it can really surface and bring to light patterns, blind spots, dominant paradigms, and so forth, evidence gaps or robust findings in scientific literature, and it can also help you visualize the future, literally. It makes reviews more transparent, replicable, for example, with the Prisma chart or our new criteria chart, and also more relevant, for example, with our audience map that I've shown you, where you know, oh, this is what I'm going to get out of this literature review right away at one glance. There are many formats, not just bar charts, that can be used, and we believe people need a map so they can choose the right visual for their literature review, and we're trying to build such a map. And I want to close by saying this. Visualization is not just a way to boost the citations of your literature review. It can do that because it's much more attractive. Visualization is also a great way in which you can keep abreast of the literature, not drown in this myriad of articles. It's one of the biggest challenges, we know that students have. They're just overloaded with articles. And then they're distracted, and then they don't know where they were. If you work visually, you always track your progress. You can always keep an overview on the literature. The visualizing is as important as the diagram that you're producing. But always be very self-critical. Just because we have great tools, and AI can help you in that, by the way. AI can now produce wonderful diagrams, but they're not always right, and they don't always add value. So you have to be very purpose-driven. And last but not least, I also want to mention this element that you saw in the audience map. When you are writing a text today, you're not just writing for humans. You're also writing for robots, imperfect robots. right, that are biased. So you want to immunize your literature review against biases. You want to always think about how is this going to be used by AI, right? And here the image gives you a way in which your view will be undistorted. You cannot control how a chatbot will reword what you have written. However, what you can control is the image that the chatbot gives to the user, because it's going to be your image. That's another fundamentally important reason why you should visualize literature reviews more, because the image will safeguard your integrity. The image will not be changed. The chatbot will just convey your image, your literature analysis that is graphic to the user. It will not bias it. However, when you just do a literature review text, you never know what AI is going to do with it, how it's going to be partly hallucinated, changed, modified, combined with something else. So keeping AI in mind gives you yet another reason to use visuals in your literature reviews. And now I'm very much looking forward to your questions. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Martin. Thank you for closing with such a compelling argument for why we should use more visualization in our literature reviews as we move towards an AI world. I was wondering if there's any question from the audience. We also might have some questions from our friends in Bilibili. So if you are watching this online, you can type a question and my colleague Ivan will help me. Oh, okay. Thank you. Hi.
Thank you for your presentation. So I have a question, like if I have a paper, have a few page of reference, so how I can use, like you showed us the diagram, one diagram can include all of the reference precisely. Yeah.
So the question was, is visualization also useful when you have few references? And my answer is yes. Remember the Joya chart I showed you? You could, for example, show a Joya chart with all your references and list them at the left-hand side with the key concepts that are discussed, the source terms. You synthesize that to certain themes, which you then can hopefully aggregate to certain dimensions. So all of your references might be potentially on the left side, with the concepts that you have found in those articles. You then systematically aggregate them and categorize them into outcomes, processes, context factors, whatever it might be, which then again, on a higher level of abstraction, you compile into dimensions. That for me is a very useful way that makes you think about what you have read, right? So you have maybe 15 articles. You try to list all the concepts on the left. You try to summarize them, synthesize them into compelling categories, and then do that once more to maybe come up with interesting perspectives or dimensions on the third level. Another thing you can always do is put it on a timeline. How has this field evolved? What is different in articles from 10 years ago to now? How has the field changed, right? So even if you have just maybe 15 references, you can compare the oldest ones with the newest ones. And you can show that maybe in the past there was less empirical work, or in the past there was less discussion of AI in design, or that it was less multidisciplinary. You can show an evolution. So I would say usual suspects, Goya chart or a timeline. Does that make sense?
Thank you. Thank you. Linda.
So do you think the visualizing process is more important than the visualization results, which could stay more like a facilitating tool inside the literature review process? Yes.
That's a great question. And traditionally, from my experience in the
Tool inside the literature review process. Yes.
That's a great question. And traditionally, from my experience in the maybe 20 PhD students I've supervised, I would say yes, the visualizing is much more important. You may use a lot of visualization, but in your literature review at the end, there may be no single diagram. But you used visualization to make sense of it, right? So you hang it up on the wall, you have post-it notes with the different articles, you build clusters inductively to come up with an integrated framework. But I would argue, and this is the idea of our book, the best visuals are those that help you in the process as a catalyst, but also can be used as an end product to communicate your analysis to the readers. The best are those that do both, help you in the process, like a timeline, but can also be used as a presentation format. But I think many researchers today, they already use visuals, they just don't share it with their readers. They use it as a tool to make sense of the literature, but then maybe they don't share it with the readers because it was like the ladder that they climbed up and then they don't need it. But I would encourage them to also think, could this visual add value to my readers? And you also have to be strategic about it. When you include visuals, your article may get more citations. There's some evidence that if you include compelling integrated frameworks, good visuals, you will get more citations because you get more attention for your article. Yeah. But if you ask me what's more important, the visualizing or the visualization, I would say the visualizing, because it's how we make sense of literature. And if you then just write it down or include diagrams, that's a second issue. But the first is you use visualization as a tool. And then hopefully you'll also use it as a communication format. Great question. Thank you for that.
I very much agree, and these days, Martin and I, we have built up quite a few whiteboards. We have been visualizing quite a lot, and our book will also show the actual visualization, but I very much agree that the process of visualizing really helps you gather new insights. And of course, you can include some of these visuals in the final output in the final article. Thanks a lot. Are there any other questions? Yes. Can you say your name?
Hello, I am, and you can call me Tina. I am in my junior year at Tongji University, and my program is Media and Communication Design. And thank you, Professor Martin. And I want to ask, how can we add and show our insight into the visualization rather than just placing some information on it? Thank you.
That's a great question. So in the way I have used visualization here, it's just, as you called it, placing information. But there are always personal preferences, judgments that influence that. This is especially the case when we go, for example, to integrative frameworks, like the ones I've been showing you, right? So while you can fill each box with literature, this is also informed by the researcher's experience of what are the key dimensions, for example, in this case, of strategy implementation, right? And maybe the researcher's team labeling, right? Here we call it hard factors, soft factors, and mixed factors. Maybe another team would choose a different wording, right? So inevitably, have to be careful not to put the microphones together. Inevitably, the researcher's preferences, experience will also affect the visualization. It's not a 100% objective placement of articles into visual schemas. And the more transparent you are about this, the better. The more you think about alternatives, the better. If your question is there not a pattern where we can have more visibility to our views? My answer is not yet. It's a very good idea. This is for me, this reviewing below, if I go back to our framework, if I just go here, reviewing below, this is where you uncover the researcher's preferences, his or her epistemological viewpoint, ontological preferences, and so forth. And maybe visuals have a role to play there to visualize your context, your role in the research, right? I can imagine in other research, you can use visuals to also position yourself vis-a-vis other positions. But in a literature review, you as a reviewer, you should not dominate. It should really be the articles who are center stage, right? You shouldn't, but that doesn't mean that there are not also creative visuals. For example, reviewing forward. Maybe you're going to design very imaginary scenarios and avenues for future research. And there, you are building on the existing literature and articles, but you're also more legitimized to point your view, to put your view in those visuals, right? I hope I understood your question correctly. But so far, most of these patterns are, as you called it, simply positioning articles in visual schemas. And maybe when it comes to reviewing forward, anticipating future research agendas, we can also use visuals to formalize our own opinion and judgment and perceptions. I think it's a very good idea. We haven't thought about it sufficiently yet. So it's a very good impulse that you're giving us. 谢谢.
And here is a very similar question, like from Bilibili, is like how can we make meaningful diagram instead of just a simple statement? Yeah.
Meaningful diagrams in literature reviews requires two things. Number one, you have to be clear about your purpose and main message. What is the so what, right? What is the so what? Have something to show. That's the first part. And the second is show it as clearly as you can. Choose the right chart. Declutter it. Follow visual design guidelines. This is also something where we have to educate researchers, right? There's a visual literacy that you have to have. So to create meaningful literature review diagrams requires two things. Have something to show that's worth showing. And secondly, show it as clearly as you can. The first thing really is about purpose and insight and interesting patterns. And here our approaches can help, but it cannot guarantee that. And then secondly, make sure that you don't create obstacles to that insight. Make sure you adhere to Gestalt principles of good design, that you adhere to good design practices, visual design rules, so that your insights are as accessible as possible to other researchers. Yes, steer clear of manipulation, distortion, oversimplification. That is a great guideline, yeah.
Sorry. Thank you
Professor Martin, thank you for excellent presentation. So maybe I have a question. I want to further this my classmates' question, how to involve the diagram and the pattern making into our workflow. Like we are design students and like many more practical discipline students, we are towards on the philosophy like learning by doing. So we want to dirty our hands, be like hands-on student works, and we make a lot of visuals during our work to explore, to and so we are often, and so the patterns are often seen like the outcome and just the visualizations at the end of the workflow. So how to avoid that and how to involve them into our progress, process. Thank you.
That's a great question. Thank you very much for that question. Let's take the pattern of the audience map as an example. I think this, you have to draw it at the beginning, but always keep it updated. So it's not at the end of the workflow. Some of these patterns use at the very beginning. For whom am I doing this literature review? Who are my target audiences? This is something that you should do early, and it may evolve. And the beauty of the visual is it has a permanence. You can put it on the wall, and you can discuss it with people. You can show it to somebody, look, I'm doing this literature review on ecological design in furniture. These are the people I really want to read the literature review. And then a colleague may say, yeah, but you haven't thought about regulators for recycling furniture at all, right? Or burning wood. And he can spot, or she can spot, potentials where the visual is empty, and you can add that. It can facilitate conversations, right? So some patterns you use at the very beginning of your workflow, like this one, right? Some you use during the analysis, like the timeline, maybe the Joya chart. And some you will use towards the end. For example, we have one pattern where you visualize avenues into the future, new contexts, application contexts, new methods to research the phenomenon, new perspectives. That's something that you only do at the end. So my answer to your question would be, use these patterns, these visuals throughout the workflow, revise some of them continuously, like this one, and use them also as communication tools with others, right? And then I think it's also very compatible with the way that designers work. Prototypes. These are nothing else but prototypes, right? And in the visualizing, you're actually doing the literature review, and it is an important sort of map for you to see, am I still on track with my literature review? So I think what we're doing here is applying a designerly way of working to literature reviews with these patterns, these templates. Great question, thank you.
One more question from Bilibili is that how can we make sure that we choose exact, correct visualizing patterns corresponding to the goal?
By reading our book. In the book, we give you guidelines for which kind of review challenge, which kind of chart is the right one. You rely on expertise, you rely on examples. So you learn the most by examples. That's why we are compiling a list, not just of good examples, but also bad examples. Sometimes you learn more from bad examples. And I didn't show you the bad examples. I didn't want to confuse you. But there are many bad examples of visuals in literature reviews. And sometimes they can be very instructive what to avoid when the wrong visual has been used for the wrong type of message that's been trying to convey. So you can find guidelines on this, which chart is best for which main message. And another way to avoid it is just test drive it. Just show it to a friend without explaining it, and let the friend think aloud, how is he or she making sense of it? And if they get really confused and maybe misinterpret it, then you know you have not chosen the right chart for the purpose. So I think that's another design practice, right? Seek feedback early also on your literature review charts, and do not give in to temptation to explain them. Just show the chart to somebody and ask them to think aloud to make sense of it. And if they get another message out of it, maybe you have to redraw the chart.
Thanks. And I think you also respond to the next question is there any like criteria or standard for the patterns? So I think you already answered this. Is there like any criteria or standard for the visualization patterns?
Well, yeah, they should be concise. So the important criterion is conciseness. Every pattern, you should understand it. We want to document it on one page, right? And it should be consistent. Pattern descriptions need to follow the same structure: name, problem, approach, visual, caveat. So it's not just concise, a pattern must also be consistent. And then the third criteria, widely applicable. It should be widely applicable, not just for management studies or design studies. It should be useful in strategy literature, in project management literature. You should be able to use it in meta-analysis, in narrative reviews, in systematic literature reviews of many kinds. That's another criterion that I think is important, not just concise and consistent, but also sort of comprehensive. It should be useful in many contexts. Hey, thank you so much. This was very useful for us also. Your questions really made us think. Thanks so much for your really insightful questions. Both people watching online and here in the room, you really got us thinking through your questions.
Yeah, and one last question is, what's the name of the book?
At the moment, it's called Designing Literature Reviews, a pattern-based approach for applied social scientists. Because or designing literature use with impact, because we're also concerned, as you may have seen, about going from insight to impact. So at the moment, the book title is Designing Literature Reviews with Impact.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming. It was really, really great to have also this conversation. It's been helpful for the two of us to test some of our tools and prototypes. So I'm very grateful for you to come, and of course to Martin Epler for coming from St. Gallen University and being here today with us in Shanghai. Thank you. Have a good day.